As it's well known, one of the most famous theories from René Descartes' Principia Philosophiae is the doctrine of Attributum, which Descartes develops in some articles of the first part, from 52 to 59, the part of metaphysics. Descartes had thought of the Principia Philosophiae as a philosophical school book, so it's not surprising that, unlike his other two public expositions of his metaphysic works, the first section of Discours de la Méthode, 6037, and the Meditationes de Prima Philosophia, 6031, in the metaphysical section of the Principia are at stake many notions grounded in the scholastic tradition, such as substance, univocity, and the theory of distinction. Nevertheless, despite the many papers, essays, and articles on the subject, one may be astonished by the absence, disregarding sporadic exception, of studies about Descartes' scholastic antecedent of the notion of attributum. On the contrary, it's sufficient to consult Fonseca's commentary on the metaphysical, or the third Suarez Disputazione Metaphysicae, to realize how much relevant was the notion of attributum in the context of early modern scholastic metaphysics. However, following these texts, we find that the doctrine of attributum was not a homogeneous standard doctrine. Rather, there was a debate in which the factions assumed positions profoundly different from each other. The standard item was the structure of status questionis. Indeed, in all the most important dissertations of that time, the structure is always the same, with three sententiae that are mentioned: Scotus, Aquinas, and other Thomists. Hurtado, as we will see, picks up this scheme from Suarez. Suarez's idea is to mediate these three positions in order to elaborate his own account. Hurtado de Mendoza, in turn, would be engaged in the same dynamic, keeping his distance from Scotus, Thomas, and his followers, and moreover from Suarez himself. In this paper, I will proceed in 4 steps. First, I will summarize the fundamental thesis of Suarez's doctrine. Second, in the central part of my paper, I will analyze Hurtado's doctrine in detail. Third, I will try to highlight the thematic points that represent Hurtado's originality compared to Suarez. And fourth, I will reach some conclusions. Suarez dealt with the attributum being doctrine in his Metaphysicae Disputationes, in the Disputatio 3, De Passionibus Entis in Communi. Between the passage from the determination of a formal reason of the object that is suitable to the metaphysics, to the analysis of the particular being, Suarez declares that it's necessary to study the being passions first in communi, then in singulis. He treats the question of attributum in section 1. Utrum mens, in quantum mens, habeat aliquas passiones, et quales ille sint. According to Suarez, in order for something to be considered the real and veritable property of something else, it must fulfill 4 conditions. That the property is a res, that it can be distinguished in some way ex natura rei from the subject of property, that the property be appropriate and properly convertible with it, and that the subject or whatever is the property does not belong to the intrinsic reason and essence of such property. After explaining these conditions, Suarez outlines the status questionis, in which, as I said, he distinguished 3 different positions. The first position is that of Duns Scotus. According to Scotus, the being possesses some real and positive properties that, first, are separated for the being ex natura rei, second, are not themselves a being. The second position is attributed to some Thomists although Suarez does not specify any names. According to this position, the being has some real passions that, first, can be distinguished ex natura rei from the being, like Scotus, and second, but against Scotus, they essentially include, also taken formally, the being. That the being has real passion is proven by the fact that if it did not have these passions, it could be no the object of metaphysics. That they are real is proven by the fact that what is not real cannot belong semper per se et necessario, and this is what constitutes the ratio of the passion with the being. It's for this reason that the passion differ, as do the Scotists, formaliter ex natura rei from the being. This is also confirmed by the fact that such passions do not formally predicate the essence of the thing, but instead the mode that is outside, extra, the same essence. Contrary to Scotus, however, this position asserts that these passions, also formally taken, essentially include the being. For this reason, this Thomist also claim that it's possible that the subject is intrinsically included in the passion, because it's not included in it as a subject. The third position analyzed by Suarez is the one proposed by Thomas Aquinas in De Veritate and Summa Theologiae. According to this position, the being does not have a positive passion, and everything that is attributed to the being adds to the only a negation or a relation of reason. Suarez elaborates its own solution, proposing a sort of mediation between these three solutions. Suarez makes here a distinction. One thing is the predicate conceived as the constituent of a subject's true and real passion. And another thing, other, is the predicate designed, explained, and predicated in the way of passion or property. And it is in this second sense that theologians take the term attributum, speaking about divine attributes. Est igitur in primis advertendum aliud esse predicatum aliquod esse veram et realem passionem subiecti, aliud vero concipi explicari et predicari a nobis per modus passionis eo proprietatis, quod proprius diceretur per modum attributi ad eum modum quo theologi locuntur de divini perfectionibus. Now, the four conditions listed at the beginning belong to the ratio of a true and real passion, but not to the ratio of the attribute. And this is true in particular of the distinctio et ex natura rei. Indeed, a distinction of reason is sufficient in order to establish a distinction between essence, formal reason, and attribute. De ratione igitur vere ec realis passionis sunt ille conditione posita in principio. Ad posteriorem autem modum attributis eo proprietatis non sunt necessarie. Presertim illa de distinctione ex natura rei, sed sufficit distinctio rationis, qua unum ut subjectum habens aliquam essentia seu rationem formalem, saltem confuse conceptam, aliud vero per modo perfectionis seu proprietatis concipiatur. On the basis of these premises, Suarez can formulate his own account that he articulates in three theses. The being could not have true and real positive passions distinct from it ex natura rei. Second, the being has some properties or attributes which are not per ratione conficta, but are really predicated of it. Third, these attributes of the being formally add or negate a relationship to some extrinsic connotation. Nonetheless, throughout these attributes is explained a perfection of a real positive being. realis positiva perfectio entis, not according to something real added to the same being, but under the same formal reason of essential being. It's clear that Suarez's account is in line with Aquinas, and nevertheless Suarez introduces some original elements to Aquinas. In the Status Questionis, immediately after introducing Aquinas' account, he had written indeed, Fundamentum uius sententiae explicatum est in ratione dubitandi in principio posita, et in rigore est vera, indiget tamen explicatione. As often happens in Suarez, with his own explicatio introduced strong variation in comparison to Aquinas' account. As in Aquinas, of course, in Suarez, the being qua being has no positive passion distinguished from it. Moreover, both for Suarez and Aquinas, the attributes add to the being nothing other than negation and relations. Nevertheless, Suarez is not completely satisfied with his claim. Indeed, he adds that by means of the negation and the relations we can explain that nature of the being qua being, perea tamen explicatur realis positiva perfectio entis. Suarez points out that the sense in which these attributes explain the nature of the being is different depending on the attributes. Dixi, ec attributa solum addere supraens negationem vel quid simile, quia sub controversia positum est an formaliter seu in abstracto, ec attributa dicant solam negationem seu relationem, vel includant entitatem ipsam quod melius in singulis passionibus explicabitur. It's clear that, according to Suarez, each attribute, though expressing in itself only a negation or a relation, also includes a positive, though indirect, reference to the nature of being. The requirement that is at stake behind Suarez's modification of Aquinas' doctrine is now clear. Suarez wants to give a stronger ontological autonomy to the attributes, which in Aquinas' account were at risk of being entirely reduced to negation and privation, that is, to entia rationis. In the following disputation, the treatment of some of these properties, for instance, the unum, will show how close to Scotus in Suarez on this point. If I insist on this point, it's because in Hurtado de Mendoza we find the same requirement of giving a stronger ontological autonomy to the attributes. However, as I will now show, under the influence of Scotus, Hurtado will go much closer to this point than Suarez. Hurtado de Mendoza develops the doctrine of Attributum in Disputatio 3, de entis attributi in communi, of Disputationes de Universa Philosophia. Hurtado's treatment is found in section 1, Utrum ens in communi habeat attributa, and it develops along the line of Suarez's discussion both for the preliminary distinction between attribute and passion and for the outline of Status Questionis. Hurtado begins by establishing a preliminary distinction between attribute and passion. Both are concepts that follow the first and quantitative concept in the same way in which quantity follows prime matter. Now, it's necessary that between the attribute considered in the abstract or obliquely throughout a concrete name and the essence, some distinction is given. Such a distinction can be twofold. If this distinction is a parte rei, like between fire and heat, or between matter and quantity, the attribute is not properly defined as attributum, but as propria passio. Otherwise, if the distinction is a parte rei, but it's originated only by our intellect, which denominate the same object in a different way, it's called attributum. Nevertheless, although a real distinction between attributum and essence is not given, still the attribute is real. Quoting Hurtado, inter attributum et essentiam non est distinctio realis, attributum tamen est reale. Because it's a real concept in the same way that God's justice is a real attribute, because it is conceived like a principle which determines punishment. Et quam vis inter attributum et essentiam non est distinctio realis, attributum tamen est reale. Quia est conceptus realis ut justitia Dei et risibilitas hominis sunt attributa realia, quia concipiuntur ut principia physicae influentia in punitionem et risum. On this basis, Hurtado exposes the status questionis, pointing out in this respect the existence of a multiplicity of opinions. As I said above, like Suarez, Hurtado distinguished three positions: Scotus positions, the position attributed to some Thomists, and Thomas Aquinas positions. The only difference with respect to Suarez is that Hurtado raises objection against the three positions within the discussion of the same status questionis. According to Scotus, notes Hurtado, there is a distinction ex natura rei between the attributes of the being and the being itself. Hurtado observes that Scotus' account was already criticized in Disputatio 2, in which Hurtado demonstrated that the being undoubtedly transcends the ways. Mi non est dubium conceptus entis transcendere os modo. Furthermore, he adds, Disputatio 5 will demonstrate that the being is formally included in any real concept, because the real concept is formally the being. But Hurtado does not stop there. He constructs an ad hoc argument against Scotus. The distinction ex natura rei exists between two positive concepts, neither of which is the other. It follows that each, because it's distinct from the other, is something, because if it was not, it could not distinguish itself. But if this is true, both are being. And consequently, what Scotus calls an attribute actually is not an attribute, but the being itself. Insofar as distinct from the other, it's still a being. Quoting Hurtado, Praeterea aperte impugnatur Scotus, quia distinctio ex natura rei est inter duos conceptus positivos, quorum neuter est alter, ergo uterque, est ens. Ergo illud, quod tu vocas attributum, non est attributum, sed ens, quia ut distinctum abalio est etiam ens. Hurtado notes that many Thomists agree with Scotus that the attributes of the being are distinguished formaliter actualiter from the being, but not actualiter realiter. In other words, the attributes would be modes of the being. Hurtado also rejects this position. In fact, that these attributes are not mode or that, even if they were, that they are true entities explicitly result from Disputatio 2, Sectio 4 and 6, in which Hurtado had shown, contrary to Scotus, that the concept of the being transcends all the difference and modes. Furthermore, Hurtado adds that such a distinction was refuted also in Disputatio 5, De Unione Materia et Forma, in Sectio 1, quid sit unio et an ab utroque extremo distincta of is physica. Finally, Hurtado concludes each mode or formalitas or as a real objective concept or not. If it has, it is formaliter being and not an attribute of the being. If it has not, it cannot be a real attribute. The third position that Hurtado reports is that of Thomas Aquinas and some of his disciples, according to which the being does not have positive passions and that the being attributes add or negate a relation of reason. This is the only position of the three against which Hurtado does not make explicit objection, but it becomes immediately clear from his elaboration of his own position that Hurtado is far from accept Aquinas' doctrine. Hurtado articulates his account into 5 points. The first, in the first place, the being's properties, which formally express a negation or a privation, are not attributes of that being. In fact, the attribute is formally identical a parte with the essence. Now, negation or privation, unlike attribute, are not identical a parte with the being. So, they are not attributes of the being. Such a conclusion is confirmed by the fact that an attribute may be predicated on the essence in an abstract way, as in the case of the proposition omnipotence is God, and nevertheless the proposition negation or privation are a being. Therefore, negation and privation are not attributes of the ends, because they are distinctly a parte like aliquid and nihil. Neither are these attributes proper to God, except insomuch as the negation means the real foundation of this negation. In the second place, according to the sentence of the authors who affirm the existence of objective formalities, the being does not have any real attribute. In fact, the attribute formally does not include the formal concept of essence, but must necessarily be distinguished from the essence itself in some way. But now, according to this same sentence, the attribute does not formally distinguish itself from the being, and therefore there are no real attributes of the being. As concerns the claim should be distinct from the essence, it results from the fact that between them there does not exist a difference, but a synonym. In this way, the attribute would not be attribute to the essence more than the essence would be attribute to the attribute. Indeed, there will be no essence and attributes, and the concept of attribute and essence will be identical. In the third place, the being as being has some real attributes. Hurtado refers to Disputatio 6, in which he affirms that in the distinction of reason there are not two different formalities in the object, but a single being which is differently denominated depending on the different cognitive acts relating it to different connotation. In this way, animal and rational constitute the same object, denominated animal from the knowledge which refers to sensation. So, when we refer the same object to connotation throughout which we form the concept of a thing, that concept is named essence, while when the same objective concept refers to the operation, that concept is named attribute or secundarius or logice adiacens. Hurtado opens the second section with his fourth thesis entitled Utrum ens sit de conceptu attributi, and it affirms that the real attribute includes formaliter the concept of being. Hurtado, above all, sustained this thesis on Aquinas' authority. In De Veritate, Aquinas claims that in the notion of truth, there is something that is absent from the notion of being, but that in the notion of being there is nothing that is not in the reason of truth. Aliquid est in ratione veri quod non est in ratione entis, non autem ita quod aliquid sit in ratione entis quod non sit in ratione veri. But this thesis is also proven as follows. The real attribute has as attribute some objective concept. Now, the concept is real, so the concept of attribute is the real being, and therefore the real being belongs to the concept of attribute. The measure premise is proven on the grounds that if the attribute did not have any objective concept, it would not be a real attribute. The minor premise is now instead because whatever was as an object concept is capable to exist. In fact, the things that are not able to exist are not able to do it because they lack objective concept, as in the case of entities of reason. On this point, Hurtado clearly agrees with Aquinas' position against Duns Scotus, who claims that attributes of being are passion of the same being. Hurtado's fifth and last thesis is that an attribute can be the attribute of another. In fact, first, the being is included in whatever real attribute and therefore implies the other attributes. Second, truth is amiable and amiability is knowable, so amiability is true and truth is amiable. Third, these attributes are referred to extrinsic denomination of intellect and will, whose powers mutually tend in their object. The will in the object of intellect and the intellect in the will of the object. It's true that the good formaliter is not the truth, because the good as good connotes is only the act of will. But the truth as the truth is the denomination which comes from the intellect. As such, an attribute is not formaliter another. The precision formaliter is important. Hurtado points out, in fact, that the real attributes are identical materialiter, but not formaliter, because the attributes indicate the distinction from the essence to which it's attributed, or which is its principle or substance from which the attribute is deduced. Therefore, the proposition God's mercy is God's justice is true, while the proposition the attribute of mercy is attribute of justice is false. If now we sum up the basic point of Hurtado's account, it becomes clear that Hurtado is far from simply following not only the solution outlined in the status questioni, but also Suarez's developments. First, it's clear that he does not accept Thomas Aquinas' main point. The property that exhibit a negation or a privation cannot be characterized as attributes. As we have seen, according to Hurtado, if the proposition omnipotence is God is true, the proposition the negation or the privation are a being is false. The negation and the privation cannot be considered to be attributes, and they are distinguished from it a parte. In so claiming, Hurtado was rather closer to Suarez, although he accepted Aquinas' idea that the attributes had to being nothing other than a negation or a privation. Hurtado also affirmed that the attributes can be really predicated of being, and that they refer to something positive which is behind the negation and the privation themselves. However, it's also clear that Hurtado is far from accepting Suarez's account. On the contrary, while not mentioning the Doctor Eximius, he explicitly affirms the being as having real attributes. And it's clear that in so claiming, Hurtado was overcoming not only Aquinas, but also Suarez, who continued to affirm, along with Aquinas, that being qua being does not have real properties. Clearly, Hurtado is closer to Duns Scotus. Nevertheless, he also rejects Scotus' main point. According to him, indeed, the attribute includes formaliter the concept of being. Here, Hurtado is not only on the side of Aquinas, but he also claims Aquinas' authority against Scotus. To sum up, Hurtado's account seems to me quite original. Though going much further than Suarez in accepting Scotus' requirement of admitting a certain ontological autonomy to the attributes, he is still on the side of Aquinas and Suarez in affirming against Scotus that the attributes includes formaliter the concept of being. I come now to the conclusion of this paper, which, in line with one of the guidelines of this conference, touch upon the principal question of Hurtado's posterity in later non-scholastic thinkers and in particular in Descartes. The analysis that I have developed above is based on the discussion of the notion of attribute developed with the scholastic, and in particular within the discussion about the object of metaphysics. The analysis of Hurtado's position, despite its difference compared to the Thomistic and Scotistic position, but also compared to Suarez's one, clearly confirmed this. In Suarez, as in Hurtado, the doctrine of attribute represents the crucial issue of general metaphysics concerning the being's properties. This finding seems to me of primary importance for a better historical perspective of the Cartesian doctrine of attribute. On the one hand, in fact, it's certain that it shall be linked to scholastic discussion. The Cartesian doctrine of attribute has its historical roots within scholastic culture. On the other hand, however, in Descartes, the discussion about the attribute suffered a significant shift because it was stripped away from the place in which it originated. That is to say, the doctrine of being as being and special metaphysics. It would be interesting to attempt, which I did not do here, a comparison in medias res between the Cartesian conception of attribute and the scholastic one, in the same way I did with Hurtado and Suarez. However, I think that this comparison, no matter how relevant, must first of all take note of what I think is a preliminary fact for every comparative investigation. The Cartesian conception of attributes, certainly has roots within the scholastic culture, but in a place in which Descartes' philosophy had already decreed the dissolution, the study of being as being. Thank you.